It's 8 o'clock, so we're going to have to make a start. Hello, everybody. My name is Tim Frenno. I'm the founder and curator of Adventurous Inc. And welcome to this month's conversation about Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac, chosen by these good people, Andrew and Emma of Miscellaneous Adventures. They're over there. Hello, yeah. You might be able to see them there. They're all over there. Yeah. We're not used to this. No. We're used to being on Zoom individually. It's very strange, but it's very exciting. So Andrew and Emma, as I'm sure you know, they're our guest curators for May. So they chose this book rather than me, which is just as well. Aldo Leopold has long since left us, so it's down to us to have a conversation about it. They've invited me into their house. They didn't really invite me. I never invited myself because I thought, well, to celebrate the first guest curation, we should do it in person. So here we are in a lovely home in the Lake District. So I'm sure most of you know, but Andrew and Emma, they're based here in the Lakes. They make wooden goods, take photos, and work in practical conservation. So guys, thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Yeah. Nice to have you here.
Nice to have you here. It's been lovely. We've had a great day. We've been for a wander. We've been down to the river. I've met Benji, their son. It's been great. We've done Lego. We've done. So honestly, guys, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a good day.
I'm really looking forward to talking about the book. It's absolutely, it's just a classic. And I've not actually read it before, even though when we first sat down to talk about it, as some of you may have seen in the stuff that I've written on the blog, I threw in an Aldo Leopold quote into the conversation, and the guys were like, "Well, it's funny you say that. We were thinking about featuring him as our book of May." So it's amazing, guys. Thank you so much. So before we talk about the book, I want to talk about Miscellaneous Adventures. How many times have you said miscellaneous?
Too many.
We've said it too many times, and we've had to enter it into our email addresses too many times, and we've spelled it wrong too many times as well. So yeah, we regret the decision.
Hence the contract.
Yeah, exactly.
Adventures, which is much more simple. But I mean, so you've chosen an incredible book, and you chose it because it inspired you, and weirdly because you guys inspired me. Then it turns out that this book had inspired Adventurous Inc. as well, which I think is a lovely lineage.
Absolutely.
And just it's tribute to what a powerful book it is, and how relevant it is to the modern world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What was it that when we had that conversation, what was it that drew you to the book, and why did you go for this one?
So I think we discovered this book by accident. We lived in the woods for 10 years, and it was when we moved to the woods originally, I guess we sort of accidentally started a new life, didn't we, really? Where we were noticing things in nature for the first time, and noticing how kind of the human hand had shaped the landscape in a way that we hadn't noticed before. So we were just reading a lot, really, because we wanted to find out kind of why the landscape looked the way it did. And yeah, we were just reading things like Thoreau and Emerson, and like a lot of kind of philosophical books about nature as well. And this is one that popped up and kind of, it was recommended to us. I think it was my sister as well. We were reading it at the same time, and she works in conservation too. So I think that's how we found it to start off with. And then I think out of all the books that we read, this was the one that resonated most with the things that we were feeling.
I think
and seeing in nature.
Because you were starting to work in the woods, and you know, having an impact on the landscape, and it's kind of what you had been thinking. It kind of confirmed a lot of what you had been thinking. Yeah,
it was. Yeah, he did a good job of putting into words the things that I had already been thinking, but in a very eloquent way. So yeah.
But it's amazing that he put all that into words like 70 years ago, and it still feels so relevant, possibly more relevant now.
I think it feels very relevant and very important now. Actually, definitely.
And I love that you, Andrew, as a woodsman and a forester, there must be some resonance there with Aldo as well as a
definitely. I mean, when I first read it, I was very new. I'd only just started working in the woods, but I think reading about his approach, the way that he approached land management, definitely affected the way that I went on to manage land as well, and shaped my career path a little bit as well.
Mhm.
So if when you work in woodlands and forestry, there are lots of ways you can go. And I think by reading this book, it taught me to kind of pursue a much more kind of sensitive approach to woodland management and to land management. Yeah, so yeah, it really resonated with things that we were seeing, and it just, I think it formed an important kind of point in our, yeah, just our way of thinking about things, yeah, and where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do. So yeah, it's been a really important book to us, I think.
So it was kind of a no-brainer when
It was a no-brainer.
there were lots
yeah.
of books we've thought about, but that one was the first one, and
Yeah.
and we just kept coming back.
Yeah.
And then there was that magical moment when it came up in the conversation anyway. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
that was the crazy thing.
Yeah.
So the other funny thing, so when I arrived here today, Andrew and I were both wearing the same t-shirt. I mean, group thinking action or what? So there's certainly something going on there where, you know, we're kind of a similar mind.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And similar vibes.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm so delighted that you guys chose the book, because it's just, yeah, it's been brilliant, and such a light tone as well.
Yeah.
There's almost nothing to it. You know, like each essay, particularly the first 12, like the calendar months, it's like, you know, some of them are just 2 pages long, but it's 2 pages absolutely packed with just this joy and this insight.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's his insights, I think, which are so sharp and so kind of, yeah, to the point.
Yes. Yeah, you can feel them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's the skill that Aldo displays in the book as an observer of the natural world that really struck me. And I, having spent a bit of time with you both today, so we went out for a walk, and at one point I'm halfway down the stream on the way back down, and what had you two been looking at? Was it
Wild Thyme?
Wild Thyme.
Really? Yeah.
We've been sniffing it, actually.
Of course, they were sniffing the Wild Thyme, but I think that, again, there's that kinship with Leopold there, that you are both brilliant observers of the natural world, and yeah, you've done some training in woodsmanship and ethnobotany and stuff like that, but I think you go beyond that because you bring quite an observant eye to that.
Yeah, I think we try to do that, and I think it's partly down to reading books like this, I think, that shaped that way of thinking.
I think so. It's also down to having lived where we did for 10 years and to be able to observe the same place for such a year on year, and you get to know a piece of land, and I guess it's in a similar way to Aldo, and having that changed a lot for us, and I think that's where it comes from. I think you notice so much more when you know the place so well, so you get that observational mind, and then that that also translates to when you're out on a hill or when you're anywhere else, you still have that sort of way of seeing, and
it gives you so much, doesn't it? Like so that walk today, it was relatively short. We could have washed it out in half an hour, but for us everything takes a little bit longer because we're stopping and we're looking at stuff, and it just adds so much, doesn't it? You know, it adds a lot of joy and a lot of interest to things that otherwise would be quite dull, I think, sometimes. So yeah, we're really grateful that along the way we've picked up that way of thinking about nature. I think it's something that, like, a lot of people could add to their lives as well, you know, and add a little bit of interest to stuff as well. Definitely.
Yeah, and it as an observer of you two observing, I can see the richness that it brings to your experience. So just to say, guys, this is as much your conversation as it is mine, and I can see, look, we've got some questions coming into the chat. So do throw your questions in the chat. I will do my best to pitch them in as we go through. So Peter's saying he's really enjoying the observation. And I mean, as you say, Peter, you know, you've read so many other Adventurous Inc books that appreciate what you can so easily miss, and I think that's so. I guess through Adventurous Inc, and what we're both trying to do is help people with their connection with the natural world. And like you were saying there, the books that we read show us how other people have observed the natural
definitely.
world, and then
Yeah.
we can translate that into our own experience while we're out there.
Yeah, definitely.
Are there any bits that really strike you about his observation? Do you want to read us a bit?
Yeah, there's one. Let's see. I've got tons of little notes in here. I thought it'd be really helpful, but I probably put too many in to make it helpful. So there is a section in which he talks about his home range. So he talks about things that he sees on his farm. So the farm that he lives on, he's not there all the time, I don't think. He's away from it, and then he comes back to his farm, and he talks about the things that he sees when he comes back. So the things that have happened to the landscape and marks that animals have made, and they tell him a story about the things that have been happening whilst he's not been there. So yeah, I think there's just a really short bit which I really like. It says, "Like people, my animals frequently disclose by their actions what they decline to divulge in words. It is difficult to predict when and how one of these disclosures will come to light." And then he goes on and he just lists all the different things that he sees. So like the fresh tracks of 3 deer, clear in yesterday's snow, pass through our woods. I follow the tracks backwards and find a cluster of 3 beds, clear of snow in the big willow thicket on the sandbar. So I think it's little things like that. It's noticing things like flat grass and then thinking about what might have happened there. And if you become observant of those details, it paints a picture about what's been going on whilst you're not there. And often you might not know. You might, I'm not like a tracker. I'm not a tracking expert. Some people would be able to know exactly what happened, but for me, that's not even what it's about. It's about thinking about what might have happened there. And that mystery is quite exciting. I think like finding something and like even
the wondering
about what happened, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I remember me and Benji once found half a fresh worm in the woods that was like still bleeding. It was that kind of, who did it? Well, what was this? And it was kind of like a detective mission.
You have to switch on your senses, don't you, with stuff like that? And I think that's something that by default we kind of have switched off.
Yeah.
And I think like even we noticed when we were living in the woods, sometimes our senses would switch off too, and we had to remind ourselves to switch them back on again. Like you could be in a hurry to get to somewhere and you switch your senses off.
Yeah.
But if you slow down and make the effort to switch them back on again, then all this stuff suddenly kind of gets revealed, which I think is really, really nice. So I really like that about Aldo Leopold's writing. He's very, very good at that.
John has come in with a killer question. Thank you, John. He says, do you find it hard to maintain a balance between being sensitive to living in a natural world and then living in the high-tech modern world? Good question, John. Go on.
Yes, John. Yeah, that is it's a real struggle actually sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we even wish that we hadn't developed such a sensitive attitude. Do you think?
Yes, I think so. Sometimes it's a bit of it
can almost be a bit of a burden sometimes, especially when you live in a world and a society now where there's so much harm being done to nature.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's very hard
and
to
seeing it. And because as well, once you're switched on to this sort of stuff, you tend to notice harm as well as the good things that you see. And it can be hard. But I think you find on the whole, I think it brings more joy than sorrow. Yeah. But that's a great question. Yeah.
And actually echoes the quote that we first started talking about, didn't it? Because when we were talking about various different books that we could choose, I threw in Leopold's quote about to be an ecologist is to live in a world of pain. And it's I'd not realised it's not in this book. It's elsewhere. Andrew updated me on that. But that's the difficulty, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is because pain and grief is love that's got nowhere to go. And actually, sometimes we do find that it's got nowhere to
Absolutely.
Go. It is difficult.
Yeah, definitely. No, that is a really great question. I think we've done a couple of talks before on nature connection, and we often end it with a warning, don't we? That like this is a great thing to get into, but be prepared for the fact that sometimes it can be difficult then
to
functioning in a society that has nature so low down on its list of priorities. So but on that, I would certainly on the whole, it brings a lot of joy, doesn't it? So yeah, and it also hopefully, you know, the more people that learn about this stuff, hopefully it can inspire positive change, and we can kind of work to perhaps fixing things a little bit better.
And I mean, let's just talk a little about when we talk about people knowing this stuff, we're not saying that you need to know the names of all the plants. These guys do, I'll be honest. Like a walking encyclopedia, but that you don't need to know the names of it. What would your take be on that?
That's a good point, because we do know.
Yeah, we do,
quite a
but
lot,
this is what we've talked about, isn't it? That we went down when we first moved to the woods, we went kind of down a lane of learning, and like feeling like that's what we needed to do. We needed to know everything, was all the names and why things happen and all of that. So we did do that, and then I think it was an unlearning and going back to how it made us feel, because I think what happened was it got to a point where the magic had kind of gone a little bit, hadn't it? Because everything was about knowledge, and then we didn't want it to be like that, and I think then it shifted again back to sort of noticing things and not needing to know exactly what things were.
Yeah. And it's about placing value on how things make you feel as well. Yeah, things like that. Things that you don't even necessarily need to know the name of, you know, like just how, I don't know, like how the wind feels on your face. There isn't a name for it. There doesn't need to be.
I bet there is a name. I bet in German for how the wind feels on your face.
That's
no slight to any German. I just love the way they have those compartmental words that build on it.
And it's probably one in Japanese.
It's probably one in Japanese also.
Like
but it wouldn't matter what the name was, you know. Sometimes
I still like learning the names of things. I don't think they're not. I just think that there's two different strands of that.
You don't have to know the name of it
in order to enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think sometimes people do get overwhelmed. You know, like I think when we first started, it's hard to remember the names of things, and then you think that you might have to learn the scientific names of things and stuff like that, and
What does he say about the first? Is having appreciation of the aesthetic? I think he says, doesn't he? So it's that it's like just looking at something and thinking it's beautiful is enough. You don't need to then be like, what is it and why? You know.
Yeah, I actually bookmarked that one, so that's quite an important one. Yeah. So he says, our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language.
And it's brilliant. And he also talks about this artificial distinction between science and poetry, doesn't he? He says science is there for making instruments of knowledge, and poetry is there for knowing the beauty of something. And actually, it's an artificial distinction, and it's certainly one that he doesn't ascribe to, and I don't think we do either. And we've seen that in lots of our books as well. When I read that bit, it really reminded me of the bit from Braiding Sweetgrass, where Robin Wall Kimmerer goes into her college saying that she wants to study biology because she wants to understand why asters and goldenrods look so beautiful together. And she's laughed out of the place by her tutors because they don't think that that's got any place in science. But actually, it's got everything to do with science, and because it's that emotional connection to how it makes you feel, rather than knowing what soils different types of species can flourish.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's about sensing. It's not necessarily about knowing.
I think a balance between the two has been really good for us, because there are times at which the knowledge of something has blown our minds. To the extent that it's opened up a whole other way of thinking about how nature works. And so I think there's place for both, but I think people shouldn't get too bogged down with the academic side of things. I think we're missing something there, like the academic side of things doesn't capture everything that nature is. So yeah, a bit of both is good.
I think for me, Leopold feels like a natural philosopher. He's someone who goes out, observes the natural world, and then makes sense of the wider world from the stuff he sees. There's a brilliant bit where he talks about one swallow does not a summer make, but a skein of geese leaving through cleaving the murk of a March thaw is the spring. A chipmunk emerging for a sunbath but finding a blizzard has only got to go back to bed. But a migrating goose staking 200 miles of black nights on the chance of finding a hole in the lake has no easy chance for retreat. His arrival carries the conviction of a prophet who's burned his bridges. And like that's like he's looked at that and he's thought about it and he's thought about what it means for a load of geese to set off somewhere a long distance. And for me, that's a magical approach to understanding the world by observing it. And I really think it's natural philosophy. But do you think that understanding the world by looking at nature is something that's a bit of a dying art? Or do you think it's being revived? I don't want to push you in one direction or the other.
I think it probably is, just because on the whole, our connection to nature and our time that we spend in nature is diminishing. So therefore, I think as a way of understanding the world, nature's probably not so important anymore. I think these days it tends to be all about like tech and the economy and things like that. So, which is a shame, obviously. So I think it is probably dying, but maybe there is also a bit of a resurgence as well.
That's what I was going to say.
But it's hard because we sort of live in our echo chamber a little bit, and to us we feel like there's a bit of resurgence because we see it with our friends and with our followers and stuff. But I'm not, on the whole, I'm not sure. It's a good question. But
I think that's been going on for quite a long time. I mean, even at his, even in his time, what he's talking about, the people, the thing that he's up against with his own opinions. That, I mean, and that was 70 years ago. So I think it's been a long time dying.
Yeah, I think it's been diminishing since he wrote the Almanac, and we're probably in a pretty bad place now as far as that goes. But I think it still has value as a way of trying to figure out life, and which I think is why this is a very relevant text now. I think there's a lot of ways that we could learn from this. We'll probably get to this in the end, but his grand idea is for the land ethic, a way in which we completely kind of restructure the way we think about society to include all other members of the biotic community, as he says. And I think that would then have an impact on society, on the economy, on everything.
And that's similar again to
Braden's Week.
And the gift economy and the reciprocity. Yes, and so.
And that's stuff that we've thought about as well, isn't it, on our own journey? We feel like nature is kind of a good model. There is that community aspect to nature. There's also competition as well, but I think
we've often said about how a lot, it's often said that nature is in harmony with, but it's absolutely not. It's just this raging battle a lot of the time. But there is community and things do kind of work together. But there's it's not simple, but it does work.
So I think it has value, definitely, as a way of forming the way that we think about the rest of the world and civilization. But it probably is a dying art. But it's something that should be revived.
It does sort of feel like, because we've got books like Braiding Sweetgrass and lots of others, it does feel like it's starting to come back. It almost feels like the pendulum swung all the way.
Yeah.
Now
I hope so.
I would like to think so.
So I'm really interested in, particularly for you, Andrew, as a forester, and Aldo as a forester, what you take from, I guess as a natural philosopher of the sort yourself, what does your experience of forestry and conservation teach you? Because Aldo said something brilliant, that the best definition of a conservationist is written not with a pen but with an axe. And I know you're pretty handy with an axe, so that must really resonate with you.
It really does, and it really did when I started on my journey as well, getting into that career. I think that really resonates. I really like that idea of being aware of what happens to a piece of land when you start to work on it, and also that you may not see the end result of the labor that you put in. Forests are slow, woodlands grow slow. The work that you do now, it will be the next generation of foresters that has to deal with what you've done. So I think partly through reading what the things that he'd written, and through stuff that I was doing myself, I think it taught me to be like a very observant forester and a very observant woodsman. Just to do something in the woods and then see what happens, and which I think is maybe how Aldo and Leopold would have done it as well. But yeah, that's a really interesting thing that I like about his approach, is that he's a really, he writes very beautifully, but he's also a very practical person as well. I think there's a lot of people who write, you know, like these days, who perhaps don't have the, it can be sort of fairly idealistic, but without that, without the practical knowledge of what happens when you do this stuff, you know, and the idea that sometimes you might also get it wrong. It's always a bit of an experiment when you do something to a piece of land, especially something like a woodland. So I'm aware that the stuff that I'm doing now, I might be getting it wrong. It might not in the future. The demand for certain species might have changed, especially now as we're thinking about like woodlands that need to be resilient in a changing climate. You know, you need to try and think long term, which is really, really difficult for us to do as humans, because we just want everything now.
We're terrible.
Terrible.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that did really resonate with me. I really like that idea.
It's powerful. And you said that about his writing being beautiful, and,
Yeah.
and it clearly is, isn't it? I mean, I think that's why it stood the test of time. And there's a great bit. The forward for this is really good, isn't it? Because it sort of sets it into context, and it says that when he went to the publishers, they didn't like it because it wasn't written like all the nature books of the time, and yet that's why it stood the test of time. But there's a lovely clarity to what he's saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that, I see a really similar clarity in what you two are doing, in the way that you communicate your love for the natural world, and it's a very open way, because you'll share recipes or things, suggestions for people to do, but not it's never done in a hackneyed sort of way. It's just a very open and inclusive. We've been doing this and offering it as a suggestion that other people. And I've always been super impressed with that. I saved this until we got into the conversation. No, I think you have got a real humility and deftness of touch in how you communicate your love and understanding of the natural world to other people, that makes it inclusive. Where does that come from?
I mean, I think that's something that we do try to do.
Yeah.
I don't really like telling people that they're doing things wrong, or that there's a specific way to do things,
Or that you're right,
or that I'm right and other people are wrong.
Yeah.
I think spending time in nature has taught us that, hasn't it? Like, and especially when you do work in the woods and you do work in land management, it teaches you that you can be wrong sometimes. You're often wrong. You know, things that you think you're doing that are right, that they can have unexpected results.
Or things you think you figured out, you absolutely haven't. And so you would never have that tone of, this is it. It's more like, this is something we've seen. Maybe it's this. Exactly. Or this is interesting.
It's also through observation as well that's taught us that too. Because often we've read stuff in books, and the book will claim that this thing is 100% accurate, but then the stuff that we saw when we were living in the woods, things would behave differently. So
which of course they do, because you can't know what everything's doing everywhere.
That's right.
Different places, different.
So I think that's what I mean about being humble. There's a wonderful humility to that, and it's quite rare in these days, because so often, particularly on the internet, people are like, yes, this is how it is, and you're not like that, and Leopold like that.
I don't think so.
He's celebrated the not knowing, didn't he? Like when he talks about the sky dance from it's the woodcock, isn't it? And he's not sure why it happens. Are there any bits? I can see you reaching for it.
Well, I think there was a quote on that I quite liked, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to find it now.
In your umpteen.
I've got too many tabs. Maybe if you keep talking, I'll try and find it. Well, but there is a bit in, I haven't found it, but there are quite a lot of bits in here where he will openly admit to not knowing what's happening. I think I really like that.
Things like, I don't want to say, I'll leave that to an expert to write about, or I think this, or so rather than definitive fact.
Oh, here it is. It says, it is fortunate, perhaps, that no matter how intently one studies the 100 little dramas of the woods and meadows, one can never learn all of the salient facts about any one of them. So he's, you know, he has a certain amount of humility as well, and I think
it
that's
also
nice.
comes from having curiosity and that kind of wanting to discover things and knowing that there's always going to be new things to discover, and so that comes again probably from observation and then and from yeah, just noticing and being curious about things.
Yeah, and I think as well it comes, some of it I've learned through working in conservation.
Yeah.
And through, you know, reading a lot about conservation, is that like there tends to be a perpetual argument, you know, one side thinks you should do things another way, and then one side thinks you should do things another way, and then nothing actually gets done.
Yeah.
So there's a voice missing, which is the middle ground, the kind of calm reasoned middle ground, rather than like two sides shouting at each other all the time. But the trouble with that is the humble voice often doesn't get heard. It tends to be those that shout the loudest. But yeah, so I think we've learned that basically through like trying to live a life, you know, closer to nature, which I think is that's something that other people can learn from just being a bit slower and like learning about nature and spending time out there and stuff, don't you think?
Yeah, I think
To
it
learn
makes
skill,
you
I
humble
think,
as well, because
yeah.
I think you learn, I think you become more aware of the fact that you're no better than anything else out there. You know, you don't know anything more than a deer or an ant or whatever. You don't really. We're just the same, and so you kind of lose that sense of you know, what you know, as humans we seem to think we're above nature, or we're somehow separate, but we're not. And I think once you realize that, and you have that realization, you live that way, then you probably can't be braggy, and you can't be because you've lost that. I kind of hope. I'm sure sometimes it will anyway.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's so have you got I'm going to ask you about another reading. Have you got a favourite bit of his writing that really brings stuff to life?
What about you? Have you got? There's so many, to be honest. Like it is.
You could probably pick a tab, couldn't you?
Yeah, I could pick a tab. There was a nice one. We actually did a reading of it already this week, but I'm going to do it again. Can you do it? Because you read it mostly. Yeah.
Okay, so it's called "If I Were the Wind," and it says, "The wind that makes music in November corn is in a hurry. The stalks hum, the loose husks whisk skyward in half playful swirls, and the wind hurries on. In the marsh, long windy waves surge across the grassy sloughs, beat against the far willows. A tree tries to argue, bare limbs weaving, but there is no detaining the wind. On the sandbar, there is only wind, and the river sliding seaward. Each wisp of grass is drawing circles on the sand. I wander over the bar to a driftwood log, where I sit and listen to the universal roar, and to the tinkle of wavelets on the shore. The river is lifeless, not a duck, heron, marshhawk, or gull, but has sought refuge from the wind. Out of the clouds, I hear a faint bark as of a faraway dog. It's strange how the world cocks its ears at that sound, wondering. Soon it is louder, the honk of geese, invisible but coming on. The flock emerges from the low clouds, a tattered banner of birds dipping and rising, blown up and blown down, blown together and blown apart, but advancing, the wind wrestling lovingly with each winnowing wind. When the flock is a blur in the far sky, I hear the last honk sounding taps for summer. It's warm behind the driftwood now, for the wind has gone with the geese. So would I, if I were the wind.
That's a banner of birds. Oh, it's like as a writer, you would kill for a line like that, wouldn't you? It's like
and I like every wisp of grass is drawing circles on the sand, because you know that when you go to the beach on a windy day, or we saw it didn't we, in the snow when we went up the hills, and you could see the patterns that had been left behind and stuff. But yeah, which is really cool.
And this is back to the poetry, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
He's a conservationist. He's a forester. You know, he's an academic, and yet he's got all this knowledge, but he can still convey it with the deftness of the lightness of touch of a poet.
Yes.
That makes you feel that what it's like to be a banner of birds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or to be wind in a hurry, and that's. So few people have that.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him particularly appealing
Yeah.
for me, and well, to us probably, is that mix of those things, because we got into this world
That's creative.
we started off as designers and artists, and we've got into this world of conservation and working in the woods, and it's very different, you know, so you have different skill sets, and it can be quite hard to juggle both things, or like the many things, but he shows that it's possible. You know, it's possible to be like a rugged woodsman, but also a poet who can write beautiful prose at the same time. I think that's that really appeals.
Yeah.
I think
that's also why we like Braiding Sweetgrass so much, because it's a similar thing.
Yeah,
He's a scientist,
thing,
but also, you know, like a poet and an artist. And so I think there's real parallel about that.
So John asked a very pertinent question to that point. He said, maybe I missed it, but how did you choose to go on this path that you've chosen? So tell us a bit, you know, because we probably have skated over it. Tell us how you ended up here.
Yeah, so the true answer is a total accident, which I suppose is how a lot of good things happen in life. But yeah, so we were originally we were both graphic designers, weren't we? And
living a city life.
And I was an illustrator, and we lived, we've lived in lots of different places, but at the time we were living,
Hove
and Brighton, and we lived in London and all sorts of other places, and then we just decided that we wanted to. We've been to Australia, didn't we? Yeah. And then when we came back, we decided that we might quite like to live in the countryside for a little while. Really, we were just looking for somewhere that had a nice place that I could work as an illustrator.
Yeah.
And then we just Google searched barn for rent Sussex, and then this place came up. We went to go and have a look at it. And it turns out that it was in this woodland, like 20 acres of woodland. Yeah. And it was like the caretaker's cottage, I suppose, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I guess long story short, we ended up, well, you particularly ended up being the caretaker of that woodland. Yeah. And you learn on the job. Yeah. And it basically changed everything. And
So we lived there for 10 years, and during that 10 years, that's where we learned what we know now, I suppose, but most of it's self-taught, but also through meeting other foresters and other people that work in conservation, and then after, I suppose, a couple of years, we started teaching workshops, didn't we? So we got into, well, I particularly got into green wood carving, and that's how I learned a lot about woodland management. And then I suppose about 8 years in, I gradually just stopped. We slowed down on the illustration side of things, and then the balance started to shift. We're doing more woodland work, and I started working in conservation with somebody else. I was working for somebody else, and we were doing a lot of work on nature reserves, which was really interesting. Really great work. So I worked a lot for like the Wildlife Trust and the RSPP. So I learned a lot through doing that, and then we were there for 11 years, 10 years, 11 years. We were only supposed to be there for 6 months, but it turned into 11 years. That's where we had our son Benji, and then we moved up here a year and a half ago to pursue another job working in a woodland up here.
And also we were ready for a change, and a new landscape, and a different sort of challenge. So it's been
And so now I'm self-employed as a woodland kind of manager. We do woodland management and forestry stuff, and coppicing, and we still do work for conservation organisations. Yeah. But on the side, well, I don't know whether it's on the side. I don't know which thing is on the side of which. But we also do like photography and some website stuff still, and some design stuff. And
because we are still creative.
Because we are still creative.
Still in us. It's a nice combination.
So the short answer is it was an accident.
Well, what a happy accident!
Exactly.
I mean, you know, and you do seem very happy. You've got the good life here. So.
It's been a journey. It's not all been good, but that's the way it goes. I think, like in pursuing this life, we've sort of taken maybe a hit financially.
Haven't we all?
Exactly, that's right. But there's more to life than money.
Exactly. You can't eat money, as the t-shirt says.
So yeah, that's how we ended up where we are, and it's still an evolving thing. I think.
It's a great journey.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about Leopold, because I think one of the things that you quite rightly said when you chose the book is just how far ahead of his time he was. And let's talk about a few of the ways that he was ahead of his time. And for me, I've just pulled out sort of three, and one is just his understanding of the connection between all living things, and he doesn't really see a distinction between humans and nature. That extends into his land ethic and how he talks about that. And then I guess the follow on from that, and maybe where we'll end up is his incredible reflections on the value of natural resources and our misunderstanding. But let's go back, and we touched on it before actually about his understanding of the relationships between all living things, and particularly at a time at this sort of time, it was very much he talks about the Abrahamic approach where land is a commodity, and we go out and make something of it and create value from that, and yet he can see that all living things have got an equal contribution, an equal right to life.
Beyond the economic value.
Absolutely.
And he's got some beautiful phrases about like how geese and their migrations just make a mockery of national borders and things like that, and they do more weaving together of countries than any statesman ever has, or probably in the world. So again, that feels like such a modern thing, that the concept of interbeing that you sometimes hear people talk about now feels very modern, and yet here's Leopold 70 years ago, absolutely getting that, and even writing from the perspective of other beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very true, and also his ideas on conservation are very contemporary now. With people are coming up with ideas now about kind of like nature-led solutions and stuff like that. That's like buzzwords and stuff that we're using now, but he was already on that 70 years ago.
I wonder if it was partly down to the fact that he was it was the very beginning, I guess, of progress, and so it was at the forefront of that kind of whole revolution of mechanization, and especially in things like agriculture, and to be able to see that starting to happen and getting out of control, like having that foresight, there probably weren't very many people like him then. No. Whereas now we have all we have all of the knowledge, yet we still carry on doing it. And so we are true, like
for him to be able to he basically predicted a lot of the things.
Exactly, he was ahead of his time, and sadly, like here we still are.
And it's interesting because this is all in America, obviously, but there are the massive parallels in this country as well. So it's slightly different culturally, but especially with farming and things like that, he's very hot on it now, and the things that he's calling for in this book, we're still calling for now, or we're calling for them now as if they're some radical act, some new thing, but he was already talking about it 70 years ago. So very, very current, very, very relevant.
I got the sense you were reaching for
I'm not sure.
Passage, or was it a groping?
I was just seeing if I could find anything to go with that.
Because then he extends that into his land ethic, doesn't he? And he is critical of us viewing land as separate, as a separate part of the community, the biotic community from ourselves, and this idea that man can somehow conquer it, and he really pushes beyond that, and he's got this great phrase that the thing is good if it promotes the integrity, beauty, and stability of the biotic community, and it's just again so far ahead of his time at understanding that there is a natural balance, and that doing the right thing is the right thing.
Definitely.
I think when he talks about the pyramid and the evolution of all the things within that pyramid, and how they've all, and like we were saying earlier, like how nature isn't necessarily in harmony, but it certainly is in balance, and you take one thing out of that, or you remove something and you change something, and it will shift. And I think that he was definitely aware of that and could see it happening.
Yeah,
I think at that point, because there was a lot of wilderness in well, what we call wilderness in America, and it was changing in front of him, and I think that probably was an interesting
yeah.
experience.
I think, I don't know whether we're quite ready to get onto this, but like quite an interesting thing about Aldo Leopold, as well as being a conservationist and very forward-thinking environmentalist, he was also a hunter,
Yeah.
which I know is like quite jarring for a lot of people, and there are bits in the book which I've kind of
Yeah,
find a bit uncomfortable with as well. But I think that did shape the way that he views conservation as well, because a bit like the woodsman who can see what happens when you cut the tree down, the hunter can see what happens when you kill the last wolf.
Yeah.
And there's a really good bit in this where he kills a wolf, and it's a very powerful bit, and they are killing the wolves because of farming. Basically, they want to protect the cows, and it's all about, you know, making money, which is still an ongoing discussion now, with wolves and things like that in places where they still have them, or the reintroduction of wolves here, for example. But he sees what happens when
don't let your neighbours hear that.
When he kills the last wolf and sees the deer take over, and then the deer eat all the trees and all the saplings, and then basically the mountain starts to die. You know, and so he understands from a very practical perspective, because he's a hunter, what happens when you remove something from that, like trophic cascade, you know, where you have the one thing at the top and then you remove that, and then everything else it falls apart from underneath it. So I think that's quite an interesting approach that he comes from, a very practical thing. And he does immediately, just for clarity, he regrets killing a wolf. You know, and he'll never do it ever again.
Have you got the bit?
Yeah, but you might have to bear with me whilst I find it on my. You mean the green fire? Yeah. So yeah, in those days we had never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf. In a second we were pumping lead into the pack, but with more excitement than accuracy. How to aim a steep downhill shot is always confusing. When our rifles were empty, the old wolf was down, and a pup was dragging a leg into the impassable slide rocks. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realised then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then, and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing that green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view.
And that's the other bit of it, isn't it? The thinking like a mountain.
Yeah.
The thinking like an ecosystem. And you know, I think in my work I try and incorporate a lot of systems thinking, and he was a systems thinker. He was that's what ecologists are.
Yeah, well, that's right.
It's understanding the
links between things. Yeah, that's right, and how they interact. Yeah, definitely.
But it's still hard to read that bit, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But I guess that he was a product of his time, wasn't he?
That's right.
And we're all, to one degree or another, products of our time. It's hard to kind of change that, because that's the way things work. That was the environment he was in. The other one of his principles that follow, I guess, from that principle of the land ethic was this idea, his intrinsic understanding that nature has a value beyond its economic value.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's really powerful. And so when I often read, even this book, I read most of my books with a map, because often we've got an adventure, haven't we? I try and follow it along. And I wanted to find where his shack was. So I went on Google Maps and found his shack. And then I zoomed out a bit. And as I zoomed out, I was amazed to see, and John and other viewers in the States, you're probably not amazed at this, but coming from the UK, where we've got this higgledy-piggledy road network, I was amazed to see in the States, it's not just cities that are laid out in grids, states are laid out in grid form. And it feels like the whole natural world being chopped up into ready-to-eat parcels. And I zoomed out more and more, and there it was, more and more, and I was blown away by it. But he really rebels against this idea of nature only having a value in so much as you can sell the resources, doesn't it?
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
And again, I think that feels very now. It feels very modern as we're trying to push past an economy which is all about profit and growth to one that's about well-being. And he got that there is so much more from the natural world than just profits and growth. He could see all the other elements.
And even now, as we try and figure that out, like, I still think we're getting it wrong because we talk about natural capital and stuff like that. Like, in order to save something, it has to have a value. You have to be able to put a value on it. But why can't we just save it because it has an intrinsic value that you can't put a figure on? So I think there's a lot to that, but that's a hard sell, isn't it, to a government or whatever. I don't know, but he was definitely, I guess he was ahead of his time, but also that's a very ancient way of thinking as well.
That's my dad, but hi Dad. He said about Indigenous people. I've always known this, and they obviously have, and they, and I think actually that's something that's missed in Leopold's book, because he's at a point where that attitudes there were very different to how they are now, and I think if he were alive now, I think that would have been part of his thinking, and he would have been spending more time with people like Robert Moore who obviously have that Indigenous knowledge and are bringing that back into the, that's what we're talking about, basically, the way it was.
That's right. So we think now that this is like a radical idea, but actually, Indigenous cultures had been just living in that way without really thinking about it.
And then they got kicked off.
And then we got kicked off of that. So we're actually, like, although this is a radical way for us to think now, we're actually borrowing ideas from a very, very long time ago, the way that we would have had to have lived in order to succeed, in order to survive. So it's, I think although a lot of what he writes is actually based on that knowledge, isn't it? That is not like stolen, I suppose, from native peoples. But that's a radical act in itself, isn't it, to acknowledge that that's where we're getting this way of thinking from. It's actually not a new thing, it's actually an old thing, but that's still radical, to accept that knowledge and then bring it now, like,
and ask them,
for help, for guidance. Absolutely, to borrow some of the ideas, I think. I think that's important. Sure.
And so we talked about him being so far ahead of his time. And I mean, the bit that really struck me is he talks about the growth of the economy. He talks about people wanting more bathtubs, and if only people wanting more bathtubs was where we are. I got a real sense of the shifting baseline syndrome, and each generation doesn't know anything doesn't know what the last generation lost. All you do is start where you are and then know what's been lost in your generation. And I could see that in both the natural world, but also in terms of the rapacious appetite of consumerism. Each generation is much more consuming than the last one. So the baseline of, well, we're going to consume a bit less and be a bit kinder on the planet. Actually, we're 3 generations.
We need to go back a long way.
We do.
That's right.
And I think that's very that's really difficult. But he's sort of setting out a post-growth agenda before we had any of the growth that we've seen. And again, I can see this big pendulum that's ever so gently starting to swing back, but it's not really. It's, we're still captured by this idea that we can have more and more of everything that we want all the time.
That is interesting. Definitely.
There's a funny bit in there about recreation, and he talks about photography as being fairly innocuous, and it's not really a problem. And it did it for Instagram.
Exactly.
Absolutely, trashing of natural places for the ground. So
I wonder what Aldo Leopold would think if he was around now. He'd be having a shocker, wouldn't he?
He would think, I saw all this.
You're right.
Told you so.
He would say, I told you so. I mean, that's the crazy. Well, he did tell us so. So he said, he said, we need a new kind of farmer, a banker, voter, and consumer. And he said that 70 years ago. And who couldn't say that?
Yeah, exactly.
You couldn't, all those things he's nailed. And again, there's a beautiful clarity of, you know, farmer, banker, voter, consumer. Still such powerful agents within society.
Yeah, true.
And in those days, there wasn't much else because society was a lot simpler. But even now, if we had different, each one of those, things would be so different.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where he's coming from. I mean, so he really reminds me in his writing of Dr. Seuss, because he talks about society getting bigger and bigger, and it really reminded me of the Lord.
It's very similar. It's the same message, really, isn't it?
It is.
We should have just done the law.
You've got plenty doing the
When you come back next time, next time there's a guest curator, you'll have to do the Lorax. So we've not really talked much about Benji and about books and reading, and I know books are really important to you. John asked a great question earlier on. He said, was there one book when you were younger that kindled a flame that's led you into being who you are now?
Gosh, that's a great question.
See, John, I gave him all the difficult questions. And John landed them like sucker punches here.
I think the truthful answer is no. I don't think so. I mean, I did read a lot when I was young.
So did I. I'm trying to think. I'm sure there must be, but I don't know.
I think like one of the very first books I ever remember reading to myself, or like big achievement, was reading The Hobbit. And I think although it's not specifically about nature, there's a lot of magic and a lot of wonder in it, and a lot of adventure. And I think that's
possibly what led us down,
like sowed a seed somewhere. You know, that there's kind of that there is a lot of, you know, adventure and sort of magic to be found in life, I think. So that was probably a big one. And we just read that with Benji for the first time.
Oh, brilliant.
So that was a good one. But I can't think of any particularly about nature. Like, I have to admit, it was something that did come a bit later in life.
Was there anything for you then?
I was a member of the Young Ornithologist Club.
YOC. I'm still got the badge.
And so me and my dad, we used to go bird watching quite often together, and I think that definitely had an impact on me, and my we used to have goldfinches in our back garden in inner city Manchester that used to come and eat the thistles that in our yard, and I think that probably was something that definitely had a huge impact on
I think I had the same, not with books so much,
but with experiences rather than I don't think
books. I used to go to the countryside a lot, and my grandparents lived in the countryside, so I remember going to the woods and stuff with my dad, and I think that those things just subconsciously sow a seed, don't they? I think even though it might take, you know, a little while before the seed actually germinates, it's I think all those things. I think all those things, they're there.
Yeah, they are.
But books, I don't remember anything particular.
And with so there's a lovely bit where Leopold talks about the joy of reading aloud with the family as a form of entertainment, and you could see the television was just coming in, and he didn't like it. And so he talked about reading aloud. Is that something that you do in your household?
You read to Benji a lot, I mean, I do sometimes, but it really is your and Benji's thing to read books together. And,
I love doing that. We've read a lot ever since he was, as soon as he was born.
Before he was born.
So I did. The only time that we've read aloud together was when you were pregnant, and I would read
John Muir.
To you, John Muir, to Benji, I suppose, but reading aloud, it's something that I'd really like to do, actually.
There we go. Maybe we should.
That's a nice idea.
Winter's evenings.
It's a nice idea. That'd be nice. If Aldo Leopold didn't like TV, I wonder what he'd make of TikTok.
It's amazing, isn't it?
But I can relate to that, definitely. I think there's a lot of joy in those like simpler things, like reading and stuff like that, I think.
And I think that's actually the antidote to the growth in the consumer society that Leopold was railing against even before. And we've got to rediscover other ways of flourishing, which aren't destructive and degenerative and extractive. And actually, hey, let's read a book, even read it out loud to each other. How lovely
It's a lovely idea. Yeah,
there's a lovely bit at the end where he says that he's still got hope, and no matter how hopeless the cause, you still have to have hope in it. And I think that for me remains such a relevant message.
yeah.
And I think he could see that there. And because on one hand you could look at it and go, 70 years and we've got worse, not better. But we can still have hope, can't we?
Yeah, we can still have hope, and I think that is important. It can be hard at times to stay hopeful. It does feel like there's a lot of bad news, but things probably have got better since his time. You know, like he sort of kickstarted the conservation movement, and since then, you know, we now have conservation NGOs and all that sort of stuff. There is like a genuine conservation movement. You know, people working towards good land stewardship and things like that, which, you know, he's kind of partly responsible for setting about. But so yeah, there are positives, definitely. I think these things are going to take a lot of time. You know, we're going to have to go through a few generations of farmer maybe before we weed out some bad practices, and there needs to be a lot more input from government as well to sort of to influence those changes.
So we need the right voters.
So we need the right voters.
The right voters.
But yeah, there is hope. I think there is hope. Yeah.
We've got to have hope. Well, I've got hope. Conversations like this give me hope.
Yeah.
And apparently, Leopold's book still sells 40,000 copies a year, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people out there who still want to hear this.
Very much so. And I think a lot of the other books that you do on Adventurous Inc., like I think a lot of authors in conservation will cite Leopold as an influence, don't you think? Like I think there's not many writers in the adventure or nature sort of space that won't have read Leopold. So I think as long as there's books like this and they're still like influencing other people and that's impacting, you know, their lives, and then they can write about it and then hopefully spread the message far and wide.
Brilliant. Well, what a hopeful note to end on.
Yeah,
guys,
absolutely.
thank you so much for having us, inviting us into your home. We really appreciate it. It's been amazing. Thank you. Like, what a great book suggestion. If anyone hasn't got a copy yet, well, you can get free ones because now we're introducing the guest curators. They get paid every time you pick up a book, and it costs you nothing. So, like, that's a win-win. If ever I heard one. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. And we're going to do it all again next month. Not with the guest curator. Next guest curator is in July. So next month we're back with an author. And yeah, we'll be back in a month's time. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for all the comments. It's been brilliant. Thank you for your questions, John. An excellent evening. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Right. I'll end it there. Bye, everybody. Thank you. They're waving.